All right, I think it's 6 o'clock. We can start. For those who don't know me, I'm Matt Gilson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Haynes Library. Welcome to the Armchair Traveler series. First thing I want to do is thank Cindy Buxton and Russ White for arranging these talks. They've really put most of the organizing in, and they also put together those cool posters that you see sitting around town. For the show, I'd like to ask participants to please turn off the video. That really helps out with the bandwidth, and also try to stay muted until the end when we'll have a question and answer session. So last week on the Armchair Traveler series, we had Dennis Geeson and Deb Marshall highlighting the art and culture of Mexico City. So if you missed that one, it's archived on the library website. It's a really, really cool one. You should definitely check it out. Next week, on Wednesday the 31st, we will have Haynes' own Maury Hayes and Julia Murph describing a 10,000 so odd mile bicycle tour from Alaska to Argentina. Maury and Julia will be presenting over Zoom, but patrons are welcome to come here to the library at 6 and watch the presentation on the big screen. After that, we'll take a midwinter break and return on March 27th through April 17th for a few more talks. And those are going to feature George Figdor, Brian Weed, and John Svensson. And we may have space for another presentation. If anybody's interested, you can just reach out to me here at the library. And then for tonight's presentation, I would like to introduce Jeff Moskowitz. Jeff has spent 14 seasons ski touring extensively around Haynes while pursuing an education in avalanche safety. He is a professional avalanche forecaster for the Haynes Avalanche Center and a recreational avalanche instructor for Alaska Avalanche School. While he's not poking at the snow or riding deep powder in the trees, he's working as an executive director of the Alaska Avalanche Information Center and contractor for database, GIS, and cartography work. His passion is exploring the mountains by ski and sharing educational experiences with the community. So without any further ado, here's Jeff. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. And this will be a presentation on a ski trip to Arctic Norway entitled Turning Around on Jægervasstinden. And it explores risk framing on our trip. All right, so as oh, is it not shared?
What's risk framing? Oh, is that what's showing on Zoom? I think it's the Zoom, right?
Technical.
It
looks like it's sharing. It says
okay.
Yep.
All right. Sorry.
All right, so yep, I work as a avalanche forecaster and instructor, and then in the GIS and database and cartography, the map world, as well as a wilderness guide. And let's see. All right, this is about a trip to the Lingen Alps, which is at 69 degrees north, which is past the Arctic Circle. Let's see. Is that better? All right. Jumping up. Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, it's just a little sliver of a peninsula with some taller mountains up to about 6,000 feet. And Oslo is down here.
So it's way up.
So it's way up in the north. And yeah, it's about 90 by 20 kilometer mountain range. There's 140 glaciers covering 141 square kilometers. And the highest summit is Jægervasstinden, which is about 6,000 feet. And then it's Gabbro, which is an intrusive igneous rock that underlines the rugged mountain range. So a couple translations that I thought I'd pull out was Tinden is peak, store is big, fjell mountain, house more like a cabin is a hita, hi is hello, harda is have it, like harda bra, which is have it good, and tur is trip, And then good tour is good trip. And then top tour is like a peak trip, like going to the summit. In April 2019, I celebrated with my brother and his wife for their 10 years living in Norway. And they were joined by their friend and ski partner, Sebastian. And so they live in Oslo, and this was their first time to Tromsø and the Lyngen Alps. So first for everybody. And we traveled to Arctic Norway, or I traveled to Arctic Norway with Bob and Hannah in 2006 BC, before they had children. And that was kind of when they fell in love with the countryside and ended up having a life there. So a little family history. Bob and I started downhill skiing with our family at Lake Louise in the Canadian Rockies in 1994. We both began backcountry skiing in college. And together we've skied across the United States, Canada, Alaska, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Japan, and Europe. And then my other brother lives in Hawaii and loves the ocean. So, but I did a little digging the archives to figure out my roots. And this is a picture of my mom and dad. So there's something in our blood that likes to slide down the hill on snow. So for this talk, I'm going to kind of get into a concept that I've been calling risk framing, which basically breaks apart the components of risk, which are probability, consequence, vulnerability, and that should be exposure. So we'll get a little bit more into it. Avalanches are a risk in the backcountry, so they release at particular times for particular reasons, and certain conditions create the strong over weak layering in the snowpack, and they're a destructive natural force, and most fatal avalanches are triggered by the rider or someone in their group. So when you're going to Norway, they have a center called Varsum, which is Norwegian for caution, and that's the Norwegian Avalanche Center. And it issues avalanche danger bulletins throughout the season, as well as has a public observation resource. And during the 2018-2019 season that we were there were 13 avalanche fatalities in the country, and 3 particularly in the Lyngen Alps. So when we look at avalanche risk, we are kind of breaking down probability and consequence, but then we're also exploring what vulnerability or how vulnerability and exposure basically lead to the consequence. So probability is like the likelihood of encountering an avalanche, or it could be some other event. And we're kind of understanding the degree of uncertainty in itself by establishing a mindset as we kind of look at the risk as a whole. The consequences are basically the outcome. So if an avalanche occurs here, what will happen? And we can kind of understand the consequences by visualizing the forces of the avalanche moving through the terrain. And this is dependent on the size, character, and terrain. And then when we get into vulnerability, we're wondering about where our vulnerability is if an avalanche occurs. Like, can I ski out of it? Is there a safe spot if I'm caught? Are my protection and rescue systems effective? Will there be trauma? So it does vary, or doesn't vary if the size of the avalanche is significant. So a large avalanche, you are vulnerable ultimately. Exposure is if an avalanche occurs, will you be exposed to it? So this is helpful when you're traveling through terrain, that we can limit our exposure by traveling one at a time or quickly. And this is kind of the most dynamic aspect of hazard. So what is risk framing? If we basically break down a decision, we can look at the probability, the consequence, the vulnerability, and the exposure, and we can look at it on a spectrum or as like a rating. So how do we frame a risk? We basically take a decision, and we break apart the probability, the consequence, of vulnerability, and the exposure. So in this case, that would be for an avalanche, and this could be for a financial decision in life. This could be whether or not you're driving down the highway. There's so many different ways that we can look at risk, but ultimately it comes down to these four ingredients. So how do we frame a risk when we're thinking about the avalanche hazard? Well, I kind of developed this index that maybe I didn't develop it, but I use it, where I'm just scoring basically the probability on a 1 through 5. And if we kind of add up our total scores, then I can see whether or not the risk falls into a high, moderate, or low category. So what's pretty interesting is that risk is just a subjective abstraction. So in this book, Bruce Kay explores risk framing as we rarely get to truly experience the consequences of avalanche risk. We only feel its potential. That is how we perceive our risk, of subjective abstraction that is seldom verified, thankfully, because that would be getting in an avalanche. It is a classic example of the ambiguous nature of validity in the absence of immediate feedback. So the thing that's unique about avalanches are that we can basically not get the feedback and know that whether or not we were making a smart or not so smart decision. So why do we take risks sometimes? Often for the love of snow. But why are some risks worth it more than others? What risks aren't worth taking? And so we can explore this through risk versus reward, risk tolerance, and risk perception, and also just knowing when to quit. So the trip began arriving with the locals in Norway, an animated bunch. So this is my niece and nephew, who are now 9 and 13. So the reason I went over during Easter was because there's a week-long break, and the kids basically went to stay with my sister-in-law's family, and so that my brother and his wife could go skiing. So Bob and I flew up to Tromsø, which was the first time I'd been there, and it has a population of almost 78,000 people. It's the largest urban area in northern Norway and the third largest north of the Arctic Circle. The other two cities are in Russia. And then it's 350 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. The region has been inhabited since the last ice age, and artifacts and building remains date back to 9,000 to 10,000 years. And the Sami are the original inhabitants and traditional Sami-speaking people in the region. So this is just kind of looking out the plain, whether or not that's Lingen or just some other peninsula. You kind of get the effect that there's just mountains that are coming out of the ocean, not too dissimilar to where we live. And as we arrived in Tromsø, I started to turn on my avalanche eyeballs and saw a couple of these slide paths that basically come down right into town. Lots of beautiful boats and fishing industry there. And this is just kind of walking around town. So after exploring the city, my brother and I, we were waiting for the other two to arrive by plane the following day. So we were just going to go get settled in. And much like our communities in Southeast, there's a ferry system. So we drove and we took this ferry over to the town of Svensby, which is where we'd have our little hytte, our hut. And picture my brother and I on the ferry. And then when we got to where we're staying, our accommodations, this was the view, which doesn't look that much different than looking out the window of some houses around here. But something also that was kind of interesting, and also just a funny way of saying it, was that my the folks that ran this place were basically saying that there had been a number of avalanche fatalities, that season is kind of like a warning to us. But my brother cleverly replied that his brother, me, was an avalanche professional, which kind of insinuated not to worry about it. And then their response was that those people were also avalanche professionals that ended up in the accidents. So nice little bit of humble news. So looking out the back, little spot we were staying to celebrate the time that they've been there. And in the morning, we took a tour up Nassen. So it's kind of at the end of the peninsula. You're kind of looking off into the North Sea. Your next stop is basically Svalbard. So you're definitely up there, and it's an exposed region. The forest, as you can kind of see down low, there's just really bands of birch trees, and not a lot of big trees like we have around here. So I thought the lichen was pretty neat on these trees through the forest. And yeah, this was the first day. Smiles, and kind of looking around. The weather forecast looked pretty good, but we kind of had the coastal weather that we're familiar with. And looking off, it's the third week. Yep. So yeah, we started to head up, and as we were, the weather was kind of changing on us, and we got up to the ridge line, and the visibility started to get reduced, and there was a bit of wind. So we made some turns on the way down. And then made our way to pick up Sebastian and Hannah to kind of get the trip started. Just kind of looking around from where we're staying. So yeah, basically I had as much Nugatti that I could eat, which is the Norwegian version of Nutella. Ultimately a little bit better, and yeah, lots of steep mountains with snow. So I was pretty stoked, in a good place, and kind of excited just to start exploring. So we took a tour. We had a nice weather window. We thought this would be a good option to check out this store, Jægervasstinden, and this involved some glacier travel and yeah, decision making as always along the way, but a little bit of a journey up to this col, and there's a zoomed in kind of getting on the glacier. So we wanted to check out the snowpack, and we'd been reading about some of the avalanche conditions there. And kind of right off the bat, if anyone can see sort of what's wrong with this picture, but essentially, as far as exposure, we're sending up to 5 people like right into a terrain trap with some large slopes and cornices overhead. So not ideal, but this was kind of what we're up against when you go somewhere that's more crowded than here in our local valleys. But yeah, so just kind of looking at what other groups are doing and kind of making decisions became something that I had to adjust to pretty quick. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see, if you can see where the guide is down here. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 people. and that's basically we're putting 10 people on an avalanche slope. Potentially, I think I've got another photo of that. Yep, there's a crown up on that similar aspect. So, but we kind of veered off into a different valley, and beautiful views, and we were getting up towards the glacier. So we dug a pit, and that's basically a 320 centimeter probe, as far down as it can go in an already somewhat deep pit. So lots of snow in this area, and we continued up and kind of looking around at the terrain, and then looking back down at the water. And these are my favorite photos where there's people pointing. There's a lot of decision making. What was funny about this slope was we spent a good deal of time coming up with a travel technique to make our way and limit our exposure up this slope. And by the time we started to head up there was like a group of like, I don't know, 5 folks from France that were just going up a different way and put us all on the slope. So again, just kind of dealing with people seemed to be a hazard kind of in itself. But more pole pointing. And these guys were pretty funny to go touring with. We let Sebastian kind of lead us off on that one, and he took a big fall, like his ski went out from under him and he like landed on his face. And he said he didn't realize that there was kryptonite around. So we kept the jokes going, but we kind of made it up the plateau, and now we're gonna start heading to the col on the bottom right-hand corner. And as is the case often, like the weather likes to dictate what's going on out there, and these clouds started to roll in. So as we kind of made our way, and we were kind of in this veil of fog, but it would clear and we could kind of look down to the water below, and then started getting some views of East Tinden mountain, and it kind of would clear and then come back in. So I got really into the time lapses. So hopefully this will play. Just let it load for a second. So you can just see as a time lapse, the clouds are just kind of pouring over these mountains. Pretty spectacular. Yep, just kind of sitting on the other side. So let's see. I'll need to get out of this. Just lost the big screen. Guess I'll just roll with it. So this was kind of a risk with a high reward, and that was just that we get to go to a cool place and take in the environment and get to be together and do what we kind of intended on our trip. And yeah, we kind of were enamored by the views and being in this place that we let kind of all the soft snow harden for our descent. And pretty wind scour. Yep, there was some wind, but we had some nice corn that we let refreeze, so we had a nice choppy almost 4,500 foot descent. And yeah, this was a large wind slab that was at least a few days old that we had watched. So the next day we headed up the store Galton, aka the big pig. And the weather just kind of came in and sure if I can. Can you guys see all right up there with this? Okay. So yeah, it was kind of a low energy, low clouds kind of day. And we made the most of it and made some kind of warmer turns back down to the ocean. And then this is looking off to the north. There's the island out there that we're looking at on the right. So we decided to go take the fishing pole that we had and try our luck because we could see some fish out there. I'm not sure what those fish were. A lot of times you can catch cod from the shore. So rather see how this goes. Time lapse. New phone features. All right, so we started driving back in the mountains. We're coming out of the clouds and lots of kind of farmland along the way, as well as like cod that was hanging up to dry. And some dorky photos of my brother and I. The older than you? Yep, both my brothers are older. How many years? 6 years. 6 years. Yep. So the next day, I guess backing up, when we were on the ferry from Svensby to go pick up Sebastian and Hannah in Tromsø, we were going to the concession stand, and we happened to bump into a friend that Louis Dawson and his girlfriend. And the ironic thing about bumping into somebody in the middle of a country far away is that this was the second time that that's happened with that same person. And they also spent time ski touring, but my brother and I were in British Columbia in a backcountry hut, and someone skinned up in the middle of the night, and it happened to be Louis Dawson. So we didn't coordinate any of that, but we made plans to meet up this day and ski together. So they joined us up Stettinen. And this was another cool ski where we're starting at the ocean and heading up. So lots of nice views, and the weather had cleared for us again. So we're having a snack. What was the air temperature? I'm not sure right off the top of my head for that day. Yeah, this day seemed to be warm. It was kind of changing between like cold and windy, and then wet and warmer, which makes sense. So heading up towards the summit. I'm getting to look back down. Yeah, just beautiful views in all directions, and that's looking north.
So back in this area, it's compared to like Brooks Range, or what would you compare that
to? Well, it's more coastally influenced than the interior Brooks Range. So yeah, more of a maritime climate ultimately, but I think it depends on the season, I think, these days. And yeah, there had been persistent weak layers in the snowpack basically the whole time that we were out there touring. So yeah, still some instabilities around. So making everybody look good, taking photos of them skiing down. But what was fun about this tour was it did end at the beach. So we got to go from the mountaintop, and there's Hannah trying to get into the ocean, I think.
Did anybody go swimming?
Yeah, I don't think we went swimming right here, but some couple times in the trip. So driving back to our cabin, getting to look around. It was just a really nice evening, and we could hang out outside. Yeah, all about the time lapse. Catches the little things that good to see. So all right, so now we're next day. We have a weather window. It looks like the temperatures are going to heat up, and the plan is to go up store Jægervasstinden. This is a big tour, 5,000 vertical feet, and yeah, kind of a longer approach. So it's the biggest day of the trip. The pros are that we have clear weather window. We have an experienced group, and we have a moderate hazard. The cons are that we're tired from the previous days. There's still persistent weak layers in the snowpack, and we have a little bit of a sunk cost bias, which is we're going, and if we turn around, then we feel like we've failed because we've we want to get to the top of store Jægervasstinden, and there's some pressures that are pushing us to get there, which we may or may not have realized. So we started really early, woke up, I think we were at the trailhead at like 5. So started heading up and trying to get through the trees there, and kind of start making our way and gaining some elevation. And a couple things kind of came out relatively quickly, and one of them was that we had disagreements on where the approach route was. So at one point, some of us were high, some of us were low. The communication was kind of dwindling a little bit. The temperature was chilly, so Hannah was basically wanting to continue to keep moving so that she didn't have to stop and put on layers. So we were kind of pushing our way up, and it felt like things were not necessarily falling apart, but we just didn't quite have the same level of teamwork that we had the past few days. But regardless, we were getting some big views, getting up into a really beautiful place. And yeah, this is where I thought I'd bring up human factor red flags. And these humans look perfectly friendly, but we can do some things that kind of trick ourselves and can get ourselves into trouble. So this tour in particular, I kind of came up with this red flag system where preceded by everything comes exhaustion, dehydration, hunger, and the cold basically compounds that. And from that, if you're deficient in any of those categories, there goes your communication, talking as a group. And then that's basically when you can start to make bad decisions. And oftentimes you might just see a bad decision and kind of be able to call that out, like you might see a natural avalanche. or you get some warning signs like the group's not really communicating properly, or somebody's exhausted and thirsty. So some of these factors started to kind of appear much more clearly in retrospect. And basically, we had descended to this point in the valley before we really could take a good break, which is more or less the entire tour. So yeah, we were pretty exhausted, and again, just kind of maybe we didn't do as well as we could planning for this tour, considering it was one of the more riskier and bigger tours of the trip that we were planning. So what kind of followed from that? Oh, this is a shot from Trolltinden, which is just this beautiful fluted peak where that maritime snowpack is clinging to these steep surfaces. So yeah, I was probably my favorite shot of the trip, and it just happened to be that we were there right as the light was kind of bringing it in into focus for my camera. So yeah, this is us climbing the slope kind of up to a bit of a bench, and at that point you can it's a little bit out of sight, but around the corner here there's a QR feature that connects you up towards a col, and then there's a boot pack to the true summit. So at this point, we're basically had left our break spot there with the blue, and you know, the QR here is over on the left, and there's a bit of an apron that you can see kind of denoted by the red, as well as many other kind of connected slopes. So we're getting into tricky terrain. You know, we had done some stability assessments, felt generally pretty good, but we still found layers in the snowpack. So we were skinning up this section here, which is right on the bullseye of avalanche terrain. The majority of avalanches release at 38 degrees, and this was somewhere between like 35 and 45 degree apron. And the snow underfoot, one way you can kind of tell if there's a slab that's building is that the snow becomes quite punchy, and that you can just poke your hole through it. So we're on an avalanche slope, basically in the prime time slope angle. We have a recipe for an avalanche. We have strong over-week layering. And this is the point in the tour when I just look down and I see my brother and his wife and Sebastian, and I basically just started thinking of if I had triggered an avalanche here, I would bury my brother and his wife, and they're the parents of my niece and nephew, and suddenly the consequences basically became too real for me, and I didn't like where I was, and I made a quick decision that we needed to get out of there. And something wasn't right. So I pulled my skins, and everybody followed suit, and we basically skied back down to the blue dot, which was a bit of a bench. And at this point, the group kind of came back together and revisited our options. And it was clear that Hannah was basically done and didn't want to go any further, whereas my brother and Sebastian were interested in kind of reassessing the routes and choosing to move more lookers left and continue up what was some old avalanche debris that had come down through the core and kind of avoid this area of slab. So it didn't take much time to kind of split the group and make this decision. And Hannah was off and I was following her, and the basic turnaround for Sebastian and my brother was that if anything started to shed from the surrounding peaks, like as the sun started to warm those slopes, things could come down. that they would basically turn away, and if they came across any of this that slab sitting over a week later, that they would also turn back around. So it was an interesting decision because I was a little torn. It was, we wanted to stay together, but basically I also wanted to keep going up to kind of share that moment. But so it took me a little bit of time, more than, to kind of figure out what was happening there. And when I used the risk framing for, why I turned around, I was looking at a moderate kind of probability or likelihood of that avalanche releasing, but the consequences of the, that were going through my head were basically at the high end of that scale, as well as the vulnerability to perform a rescue or to have not basically all be caught in this slide. That was pretty high. And then the exposure, being on that slope without a lot of places to go, also left me with a high score. So when I totaled it, I was in the high category, essentially. So for me, that was a risky position to be in, and that was part of why I turned around. So my thoughts on it were that at that day, human triggering an avalanche was still possible. That's what the moderate danger means. I was using post-mortem analysis. I was basically thinking, if this slide were to happen, and what would the newspapers read, and how would that kind of affect my decision making? And basically, the risk was outweighing the reward. I rather have just been enjoying the mountains without having to think about it. So my mindset was more, my mindset as well as as an avalanche professional is to limit my exposure because I'm spending a significant amount of time in the mountains. So this is what I ended up with, a bunch of turns down into this basin, and got to hang out with Hannah and kind of watch the day. So if we use the same risk framing and look at my brother's decision to go up, which I'm extrapolating, the probability, it would be the same. The consequences of this new route that they had chosen up seemed to notch it down, especially having 2 less members there. The vulnerability, basically, there was some visual things that were showing that there was had been previous avalanche activity, so that maybe there wasn't a slab built up. And then the exposure didn't really go down too much, but he still scored a 10, which left him in basically a notch above yellow there. So kind of stepping out and taking a risk, but that was potentially worth it. So the thoughts on that was that there was avalanche debris in the couloir, so they maybe think that the slab had already released there, and that the snowpack was more stable heading up that route. They reevaluated it to reduce their exposure, and then the rewards outweighed the risk. And with my brother, the mindset was less, he's spending less time in the mountains, so thus he has less exposure, so that it seemed that this was worth the risk for him. And so this is them heading up the couloir, and they were able to make it to the summit. Yeah. That's another group that was starting up. Yep. So, yep, it was an interesting day in the mountains, and here's a kind of a time lapse from our just watching the clouds move. And I think at this point too, there was, a bit of, waiting just was a little bit of yeah, just not really knowing. And one of the ways that I think we could have kind of solved that problem was if we had brought radios along so that we could communicate with them. So they were definitely stoked to have gone up and had the day, and we're all happy in the end. And this is heading back down and out the basin. And there were these cool, not sure what type of mushrooms they were, but kind of like a conch that was growing off of these birch trees and some of the peaks behind. So this was our, we had one day of weather in between, and then we basically took the ferry back across and we did this tour to on our way back into Tromsø. And the weather was kind of forecasted to be mixed, but this was cool because it kind of gave us a look back at the Lyngen. So we had actually hopped over on the fjord across the water there. So it's looking back on the Lyngen Alps. It's the time lapse. And looking around at some of the surrounding mountains. And then these really cool clouds started to build. And that was just this long ridge line. And we did get a few, we were able to find some unstable snow, but mostly it was kind of a mellow, long approach. Not a cloud expert, but I think these are alto stratus clouds. And my nice camera had run out of batteries at this point, so I was using the phone. So nice long ski descent. Some different techniques. Sweet. And then we had the return to Tromsø, which is just driving. You can kind of see the range in the background there, and do a little loop and then come into downtown Tromsø, where we spend the night and then fly out in the morning. And somehow the three of us ended up at the discotheque well into the evening, and found out that Norwegians like to party. The party starts at like 12:30 in the morning.
What did those beers cost?
The beers were probably $20 or something. But, so, all right. So some lessons learned. Really the importance of careful pre-trip route planning, which involves choosing snack spots and decision points in safe zones, having a menu of options for the day. So not just kind of choosing one, and then choosing appropriate objectives, and considering everybody's in the group's ability level, as well as carrying radios, and then utilizing this kind of risk framing for decision making in the backcountry. And that is all I got. So are there any questions?
If you get questions here, do you mind just repeating them for the Zoom audience?
Sure. She said shift 5.
should emphasize. In your experience, once you had a slope slide, how likely is that slope to remain unstable? If you're hiking along and you come across a slide, it's obviously settled well. And you have, there's no indication there's been fresh snow on that area recently. Like, how stable would you consider that?
You know, typically if back to this store Jægervasstinden point is that even though that's the core that had already, you know, essentially avalanched at some point, there was still wind slab that had built near the top of it, is what they had kind of reported. And so yeah, although like most of the weaknesses would be gone on that lower section, it didn't mean that there weren't other places with other avalanche hazards. And the thing that happens in those features is that you have mountains around that are heating up. The other kind of avalanche problem was wet snow, so there's sunlight that's hitting these features with rock and ice and objective hazards that can funnel down. So even though the slope in front of you might look, you know, swept, yeah, that there are these other hazards and risks to think about, which involves our exposure when we're thinking about the risk framing. So yeah, there was still risks involved being in that environment.
Your elevation you gave, but like, what was your mileage roughly in that elevation? Like, how far?
It was probably like a 12-mile round trip, maybe a little bit more. So
For which one?
for the big, yeah, the store, Jægervasstinden.
What would you say the best time to ski over there would be?
I think spring, yeah, except that the crowds,
How popular is it?
well, it's quite popular, yeah, in Europe for folks going specifically to that region. And oftentimes that will be what is the factor that increases fatalities with people coming like tourists basically. But yeah, in that specific case, there was some other more local individuals involved.
You mentioned some cabins. Is it kind of like centralized cabins?
It was the place we stayed was more like a cabin, but it was essentially like an Airbnb. But yeah, there are lots of cabin systems across Norway, but yeah, we didn't use any of them there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just standard part of the country. Yeah, the difference in maybe our maritime snowpack versus theirs would just be how far north you are in latitude, which has to do with the angle of the sun as well as temperature. So, you know, if there are, you know, weak layers that are forming, the weaknesses can be accelerated by those cold temperatures that you get that far north. So yeah, it's probably more like a mix of like a maritime and like a cold continental. But I do know that that conditions have been changing, and you know, the norms aren't necessarily there as far as warming up and the colder temperatures. So yeah. That's like, it's an Easter egg. I think it was for the kids, but Hannah had brought it along with eggs for everybody.
The ocean, do you like freeze up there?
No, it's similar to here. Yeah, I mean, the ocean will, like regulate the temperature, but,
It's not like the ice that wasn't there for some mysterious reason.
yeah, it's not quite, you still have, I'm not sure the distance, but it's a good chunk of 100, maybe 200 miles to Svalbard.
Oh, okay.
We're about to go out on a boat, like a week to 10 days, and going to little bays, and, you know.
Yeah, so I have a map of the Lingen Alps there over there on the table, and basically the road is only on one side, so that's what we were using to access. But on the other side, it's primarily boat
So you
access.
hire a boat.
Yeah. And there are thus endless amounts of fjord and mountains
And then you
that they
just
go
leave
to.
on
So
the boat.
Yep. yeah, there are some, camping there would have been kind of fun, but also potentially pretty harsh. In between some of these days, it was very wet and warm, so it was. Yeah, but generally speaking, we had good weather. The views were most number one for me, but so.
Do you have
Nope.
any questions on? Oh, Dennis.
Dennis has one.
Hey, Jeff. Just a question on your risk analysis. I'm just curious, when you're in a group situation, say there's, 5 or 6 of you going way up crazy terrain, and one person in your group does your risk analysis, and they come up with like a 15 or 20, and the rest of you guys are like 8. How do you handle that?
Did everyone hear that?
I don't know.
So he's asking if everyone in the group comes up with a risk total from scoring using that method. What do you do if you have 15 and everyone else has an 8? And my answer would be that you default to the person who has the 15. And the reality is that it might not be the day that makes sense for them to be up there. And oftentimes that's what can get us into a lot of trouble, is when you have that kind of push and the group is unable to listen to basically the how someone's feeling. So yeah, that's the thing about it, is that everyone's going to have different levels of risk tolerance, and some are going to be okay taking more risks, some don't want to take as much risk, and it's all about kind of balancing that when you're finding your partners. And the thing is, when you're skiing with your family, you're kind of like, they're like your forced partners, but in a good way. So. Anything else?
So it's probability, consequence, what's the third one?
Vulnerability and exposure, and those are go for it, Cindy.
ECBE.
Yeah,
I just want to say those pictures are amazing. That is so cool. I'm not likely to ever do a trip like that. So thank you very much for sharing pictures of places I will never get to. Thank you.
no problem. Yeah, that's been fun. Yeah, oh yeah.
I was gonna ask, the risk framing that you have before things, is that something you find yourself like actually assigning numbers when you're in the field? Keeping those things in your head.
I'm thinking about it more in my head. I think that some of the first things you could think about, I'm just gonna go back here. The first things to think about are probability and consequence. So, in this case, what's the likelihood of me triggering an avalanche? Well, say that's low, but what are the consequences of triggering that avalanche? maybe they're very, very high. So you end up in this, there are these different quadrants of this low probability, high consequence, or you have high probability, low consequence. So kind of just thinking about it with those two factors is useful, but yeah, the vulnerability and exposure play into that in a lot of ways. They'll say if you're on a steep slope and you can put a rope on, that lowers your vulnerability. If the consequences of crashing and hitting your head, the vulnerability of putting a helmet on like reduces that. Whereas your exposures, the time spent, traveling under that slope. So yeah, there's just different ways that you can kind of look at this. And oftentimes even vulnerability is, there's like a physical and there's an emotional component of it where, it just might not be, you might not know why, but it's not your day to be,
That could be
going
a
to the top.
good vulnerability. Like somebody's feeling good and the other person's not.
Yeah, I think, in other activities and other parts of life, like I've used this a lot, and Rachel knows, but if there's like a decision that we need to make, we'll list this out and basically score it, and it'll help to paint the picture of, what's the risk of, taking a new job, or, getting on, merging onto a 7-lane highway, or, yeah, so, and I think that one of the most important things, and just to close with, is that risk is a subjective abstraction. It's not the actual event, the thing that's happening. It's the way that you're sort of preparing for the chance, of that happening. So it doesn't always have to make sense, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, thank you, Jack. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and